PowerPoint?
How do we turn it on?
Ah, it's there. Okay. You can't see. Yes, it's on.
Can we
See it on the screen here.
see?
So we can see what we're talking about.
Anch'io ho paura. Anch'io ho paura, ma la vinco. Bene, buongiorno, benvenuti. Ci predisponiamo per l'inizio dei lavori di questa mattina. Possiamo prendere posto.
Yes, but how do you change the slide?
There are a lot of people anche sugli spalti.
No, but how do we change?
C'è parecchia gente. Bene, allora prendiamo posto. Jacques Simporé. Buongiorno, benvenuti a tutti. Speriamo che il tempo del riposo sia stato proficuo anche per decantare le informazioni, le riflessioni che abbiamo iniziato ieri. Forse qualcuno alle 4 stamattina ha voluto controllare se l'universo era ancora in equilibrio e abbiamo avuto la conferma che per il momento lo è, quantunque sia forse un equilibrio fragile e instabile. Iniziamo la sessione di questa mattina che entra più nel cuore della posizione in cui gli esseri umani si trovano nell'universo, sul pianeta, e passo la parola per l'introduzione al professor Jacques Simporé.
Merci beaucoup. Et nous allons parler en français. Hier, les panélistes nous ont poussés à effectuer un triple saut. Le premier saut part de la cosmogénèse jusqu'à l'apparition des premiers organismes vivants. Ce premier saut, décrit par le professeur Guido Tonelli, a eu lieu il y a de cela 13,8 milliards d'années avec la théorie des Big Bang de Georges Lemaître, la théorie de la relativité générale, les trous noirs, les ondes gravitationnelles formulées par Einstein et la physique quantique énoncée par Bohr, jusqu'à l'apparition de la vie. Le deuxième saut part de la biogénèse. Il y a de cela 3,5 à 4 milliards d'années à l'Holocène, à l'entame des activités anthropiques de Homo sapiens. Il y a de cela à peu près 300 000 ans. Ainsi, la genèse de la vie commence avec l'apparition des macromolécules, les processus biochimiques, les différents mécanismes de la biologie moléculaire, avec le métabolisme des premiers organismes primitifs décrits par le professeur Sarah Johnson. L'Holocène se caractériserait par un climat relativement stable et chaud, favorable au développement de la civilisation humaine. Le dernier saut, c'est-à-dire le troisième triple saut, avec le professeur François Hévé, part de l'Holocène avec les activités anthropiques. L'homme prend conscience de soi-même, s'interroge sur lui-même, sur les autres et ses activités. L'Anthropocène est un concept qui a été proposé pour décrire l'époque actuelle de la Terre, marquée par l'influence prédominante des activités humaines. Malheureusement, ce n'est pas un thème univoque. Et nous aurons le temps de réfléchir. Et ce qui est sûr, sur le plan culturel, ce concept serait une époque où la prise de conscience de l'impact humain sur la planète entraîne une réflexion sur notre relation avec la nature et notre responsabilité envers les générations futures. Ça, c'est plus ou moins, nous sommes rentrés dans le thème d'aujourd'hui, qui est un pont entre ce que nous avons vu hier et ce que nous verrons aujourd'hui. Ce matin, nous allons écouter le professeur Zalasiewicz, je ne sais pas si j'ai massacré le nom, professeur émérite de paléontologie et de stratigraphie, Université de Leicester, Royaume-Uni. Il est membre du groupe de travail sur l'Anthropocène. Il a enseigné et effectué des recherches sur la géologie et l'histoire de la Terre, en particulier sur les écosystèmes et environnements fossiles qui s'étendent sur plus d'un demi-milliard d'années de temps géologique. Le professeur et ses collègues du travail sur l'Anthropocène considèrent cette époque a commencé au milieu du XXe siècle avec la grande accélération des activités humaines après la Seconde Guerre mondiale. À l'actif du professeur, nous pouvons dire, nous avons vu dans Google Scholar, il a plus de 460 publications scientifiques avec un H-index de 63. C'est énorme. Il a été cité par ses collègues chercheurs près de 24 004 fois. C'est hier que j'ai regardé. Le professeur est un grand maître dans son domaine. Professeur, you have the floor.
I think it's,
Professeur?
no,
Hein? Ah, you, ah.
and me.
Yeah, voilà, you have the floor. Ah.
Okay, good morning all, and thank you for that kind introduction. Julie and I are grateful for the pleasure and the privilege of being here with you all today to introduce this idea, this new and disruptive idea of the Anthropocene and why it might have relevance for the kind of discussions that are taking place among us yesterday and today, and indeed subsequently. So, let's start by a context, and this is a historical context, a planetary context of the last 60,000 years. When one can see a clear division between a kind of planet between 60,000 years ago and just over 10,000 years ago of great climatic instability, with about every 1,000 years the Earth going from cold to warm. And this contrasts markedly with the last 11,000 years, right at the end there, of a climate stability, a stability of climate, sea level, and biosphere, which allowed humans to settle, to develop agriculture, cities, and to flourish in general in these stable conditions. Are these conditions still here? That these conditions are not still here was really first clearly announced in a formal sense by this man, Paul Crutzen. He's not a geologist like me, but an atmospheric chemist. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on the ozone layer. And in February 2000, he was at a meeting in Mexico, in Cuernavaca, listening to many scientists working in Earth system sciences talking about global change, different kinds of global change in the Holocene, which they still kept referring to. And his colleagues saw that Paul was getting progressively more irritated by this, until eventually he stood up, he burst in and said, stop it. Stop talking about the Holocene. Things have changed too much. We're in the... And on the spot, he devised the term and the idea of the Anthropocene. a new kind of planet, he suggested, different from that in which civilization had developed. And this was an idea which was very quickly taken up. First, Paul himself, a very energetic scientist, developed it and pushed it with many of his colleagues, including Will Stephan, then the head of the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program. And for several years, they used this term and this word of the Anthropocene as an epoch after the Holocene. They developed other ideas around this, notably what was mentioned just now of the Great Acceleration. This is work done by Will, by Paul, by the historian John McNeill, to gather data over the last 300 years or so. And the scientists expected a smooth change, let's say from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the present. But it was John McNeill, the historian, who had suspected rather a slow change for a long time and then a rapid change from the mid-20th century onwards. You know, something that's a great acceleration, the post-war economic miracle, les 30 glorieuses, you know, of post-war development, which is one of the key ideas behind the Anthropocene. Now, the geologists, which I'm one, as ever, you know, are kind of slow and late to the party, but eventually they noticed that there was this word out there, a word, the Anthropocene, specifically meant as a geological time term, a geological epoch, which had been developed, which had been used, but had never gone through any of the formal examination, analysis, bureaucratic agreement that is necessary for other terms on the time scale, like the Jurassic, the Carboniferous, the Pleistocene, and so forth. So, rather late in the day, a group, including myself in London, discussed the article and decided there was something to it. This might actually be real for geology and the planet. And as a result of this, we got an invitation to become properly bureaucratic ourselves and form an Anthropocene working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which oversees the geological timescale. And it was an improvisational group. It included many non-geologists, you know, oceanographers. Paul Crutzen was a member, as was Will Stephan. Julia is now a member as well as a historian. So something quite new for geology. And we got to work. And over 14 years or so, we gathered the evidence as best we could to say, is this Anthropocene really real? And at the end of that, we decided that it was. And we suggested to all of the bureaucratic bodies above us that the Holocene should be ended in the mid-20th century, and that from then the Anthropocene should begin as a new epoch to be formalized. We submitted this at the end of 23, and very shortly afterwards, the powers that be above us decided that they did not like the Anthropocene as part of the time scale. For a number of reasons. It was too short, they said. 70 years, one human lifetime. What is this in geology? It included lots of things they didn't like as geology. Pollution, landfill sites, and things like that. And also it was too political. It had political implications, something quite new for the time scale. So it is still an informal term. But it is real, and I think that is the main part. It has a reality to it which affects us all, and particularly it will affect the generations coming after us. So let's look at this reality, and this again is one of these graphs showing trends in greenhouse gases over 30,000 years from the end of the Ice Age of the Pleistocene through the Holocene into the present. And you can see for 30,000 years, you more or less have a straight line, slight rise from the Ice Age into the Holocene. And then most of the Holocene, it is a horizontal line And then these greenhouse gases rise in a vertical line in basically the last century to levels not reached for many thousands, indeed some millions of years. And temperature as a result is also beginning to go up. So just in this sense, this is what is meant by the Anthropocene, a change from the stability of the Holocene, a large and dramatic change. And this is to be contrasted with, if you like, a rival interpretation of the Anthropocene, which says it's anthropo, and therefore it includes all of human impacts stretching way, way, way back through the Holocene into the Pleistocene, to the beginning of hunting and all of that. But that is a quite different Anthropocene. And again, the Anthropocene, Paul Crutzen talked about, that the Anthropocene Working Group on, that Julie and I are talking about, again, is this Anthropocene. Not anthropogenic things, but it's a planetary change very, very recently in our lifetimes. And of course, one of the great parts of that, the drivers of that, is our immense use of energy and how that has grown since industrial times, and especially since the mid-20th century. So that shows the growth over about 250 years of coal, oil, and gas, starting slowly and then rising dramatically. So more than 90% of all of the coal, oil, and gas ever burnt has been burnt since 1950. Humanity has used more energy in those 70 years than it used in the previous 11,000 years of the Holocene. It is an extraordinary change. And of course, it's having an effect. As we all now know, climate is beginning to shift. So the Earth is warming up as a result of the greenhouse gases coming in, and that is still an ongoing process. There is more to come with warming. And the heat we feel in the air, and that is measured in that previous graph, is only a small part of the heat. Most of the heat, more than 90%, that is being trapped by these greenhouse gases is going into the oceans. And that is measured in things called zettajoules a year. I don't understand zettajoules, but I'm English, I understand cups of tea, so it's equivalent of pouring 4 billion cups of tea, hot tea, into the sea every second. And of course, that warming sea is trapping that heat and then slowly releasing it like a storage heater. And it's also causing ice to melt. So it's called, there's a picture, the red is where ice is melting around Greenland by billions of tons a year. And one can show that, let's say, by this nice, scary recent cartoon showing the amount of ice lost every hour from Greenland as a result of global warming. So in this talk by Julie and I, it will be half of that from Greenland, an equivalent amount from Antarctica, and something more from the world's mountain glaciers. And as a result of that, of course, you take water from ice locked on land, put it into the sea, and sea level is rising. For 3,000 years before this, sea level had been constant to within about this, 10 or 20 centimeters or so of the Holocene. Remarkable stability. But that is now coming to an end, and sea level is now rising. It cannot fail to rise with the heat now locked into the system. So at least 1, 2, 3 meters of sea level rise are locked in and will happen no matter what we do. And that sea level rise will, over the next century or two, drown those purple areas of land, the low-lying deltas and coastal plains on which many people live and many megacities are located. So that will now happen. I cannot see any way for it not to happen, over the few generations to come. And whatever changes we have, however hot it gets, which depends on how many fossil fuels we burn, in effect, these changes will last for many thousands of years, for longer indeed than the Holocene has lasted, because carbon dioxide, once in the atmosphere, stays in there for many thousands of years, and its heating effects will carry on in there. And of course, the Anthropocene is not just climate change. Climate is one of the central aspects. It governs many, many things on Earth, including our own lives. But the Anthropocene is about total planetary change. So it includes things like pollution of thousands of different kinds. But plastics pollution is one of the most visible kinds of this new material that came in when I was a child into the Earth. Now hundreds of millions of tons made each year, getting everywhere. It's on mountaintops, it's at the bottoms of the oceans, it's everywhere that we see. And it won't go away. It will stay, and it will form future fossils for millions of years to come. Other things, pesticides, herbicides, thousands of kinds of pollutants, which also get everywhere. There's a lake. This is a lake in Scotland. It is beautiful, looks pristine on the King's estate in Balmoral in Scotland. It has no rivers coming into it, and yet the rain has brought in pesticides which appear in the sediments of the lake from about the 1950s. As a clear marker, nitrogen phosphate we release in huge amounts. We've doubled the amount of nitrogen and phosphate at the Earth's surface in the last 70 years. And that, of course, is causing all kinds of problems like eutrophication, killing off animal and plant life when it escapes, into lakes and rivers and the sea. And of course, as a signal, the sharpest signal is that of nuclear radionuclides created largely by the nuclear bomb tests from the 1940s and 50s, mainly the 1950s, from the large thermonuclear tests, which have scattered plutonium, cesium, and so on, to create a signal. You can go to pretty much any lake around the world, drill into it, find the layers of sediment. You'll find plutonium there, starting 1952, end 1952, which we take as the effective beginning of the Anthropocene, formally. And of course, life is also changing in that, and that is the most important part of the Anthropocene change, also the most complicated part of Anthropocene change. So one of the things that is clear is that we are heading towards a mass extinction event to rival those of the end of the Cretaceous, let's say, when the dinosaurs died out. We are not there yet. It is very difficult to gather the data on this, but it's clear that the rate of extinctions are rising rapidly. But what is clear, much more clear to a geologist like me, is another kind of biological effect, the way we have taken species from one part of the world and transported them to another, between every continent and every ocean. Let's say things like the zebra mussel, there, a shell from Asia, which is spread across Europe and spread across pretty much all of North America in vast amounts, just in the last 40 or 50 years. It's a new signal, one of many thousands of this kind of new signal. And the changes, again, are we are so used to them, we hardly recognize. But if we take mammals on land, all of mammals, and just weigh them, we as humans are about 1/3 of the weight of all mammals on land. The animals we keep to eat, goats, pigs, sheep, and so on, are most of the other 2/3. Wild mammals on land are now 2% and falling. A few years ago, this talk was 3%, and before that 4%. Now it's 2% and falling. So it is a unique phenomenon. And of course, as biomass slowly falls, that green line at the top there, over the century, there's slowly less life on land in total. The amount of things that we make, our technological things, this lecture theatre here, all of Rome outside, all of Leicester, where I come from, or Chicago, where Julia comes from, all of the material we make and use has now grown very quickly to weigh more than all of the weight of life itself. And that the point's crossed just a few years ago. on there. So, just to sum up if you like, the geology, the rock side of things, and the Anthropocene Earth system, Paul Crutzen was right. It really is strikingly different. It's a departure from Holocene conditions, and in many senses, a departure from geological conditions even previous to that. So the Earth is, broadly speaking, it's hotter, it's getting hotter, it's more polluted in myriad different ways, and the biology is dropping and changing. Geologically, to a geologist, it is chalk and cheese. It is really sharp how you see this, whether looking at the strata or you're looking at the processes. And of course, the main thing, the reason, and again, this is where Julia comes in now, the important thing is that this is affecting the conditions of habitability. It will affect our ability to live, let alone flourish, on the planet to come. So with that, I thank you for this attention. I hand over now for the relevant material from Julia.
What happened to my slide? Okay. You get to see it all in. Well, it was just fine.
Continua la presentazione di prima. It's on the continuity of the same presentation, was it?
Yes, it was the same presentation.
Yeah, yes. Era la
so
stessa
we were just
presentazione di prima.
continuing on. Okay. Yeah, don't change anything. Okay. We're getting there, folks. Ooh. It's taking, I'm not touching, I'm not,
Let's go, hold on.
They're doing it, I'm not doing it.
Got that. Are we there?
No, we're not there.
Bisogna tornare all'ultima
Would you
presentazione
please let
della
me
stessa
take charge?
serie.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Sorry about that. I am Julia Thomas. I teach at the University of Notre Dame. My home field is the intellectual history of Japan. So you may wonder why I am the tail end of Jan's talk. The reason for this is that we cannot understand the transformation of the Earth system without understanding the transformation of human systems. And so this remarkable transformation of the Earth system that Jan has described as happening sharply in the middle of the 20th century was accompanied by some of the best of times for human societies, which were also leading to what will be and what is rapidly becoming the worst of times. So what happened in the beginning of the Anthropocene, with the enormous energies we put into extracting resources and building new systems, not just technological systems, but political systems, organizational systems like the UN, is that we began to live longer lives. There were more of us who lived, and our lives were more ample. And from these conditions, we learned a lot of the wrong lessons. And so there were revolutions in the numbers of people. These are the population figures globally. We also had a revolution in human health, which underlie that rise in population. These aren't just sanitation systems and agriculture and antibiotics, but also information systems, educational systems, government programs, which my own country's government is now sadly pulling away from in terms of vaccines. And this felt good. This felt like we had the answer. It also led to a rise in per capita consumption globally. Not evenly, of course, but overall, people were leading more ample lives. This is also true with a revolution in human rights. After World War II, we got rapid decolonization in many parts of the world. Democracies increased, women's rights increased, education increased. It looked like we had gotten things right. And as Dipesh Chakrabarty has pointed out, we need to think about that rightness, because in fact, many of the modern freedoms that we have built are based on the ever-expanding use of fossil fuels, based on economic prosperity. And our successes, these extraordinary successes, have destabilized the Earth's system. So we're no longer in that lovely green zone, but we have pushed beyond planetary boundaries and are now not just drawing down on past resources of rocks, of fossil fuels, those things that were developed in the past, or present resources, what we eat, the organic things that we enjoy, wood, things like that. But we are now colonizing future resources. We are drawing down on the very possibility of life for our descendants. And so every year, humans take the amount of systems that the Earth system can reproduce in terms of biology, only what it can produce in a year, but we are drawing down on 1.75 planets per year. And this is rapidly rising. So how are we doing this? How are we colonizing the future? We've developed something that a man named Peter Haff has called the technosphere, which is not only the 30 trillion tons of infrastructure that we've built, but also our political systems, our educational systems, our governance systems, our economic systems. And this technosphere requires ever more energy and ever more materials, which it does not recycle. So it is drawing down and drawing down and drawing down and not recycling these. And it is outside our control. We may be able to influence it, but we can no longer control it. It is an emergent system, not something that anybody designed. And yet, we're all dependent on this technosphere to live. Even the poorest of us require that this system be kept in place. Half of the nitrogen atoms in your body are artificial nitrogen. If we don't continue to use the fossil fuels and the artificial processes to produce this nitrogen, me, we will not have enough to eat. So we have to keep these systems going. And yet we need to begin to figure out ways to undermine them, to localize them, at the same time that we are helping them to grow. And so what we're seeing here is what the siloed thinking of our sciences and our other disciplines have given us. We are used to solving problems by breaking them down analytically and approaching them individually. What we need to start doing is thinking in terms of systems. The Earth system, human systems. We cannot solve climate change while sacrificing biosphere diversity. We can't approach these things singly. We must approach them as connected. And the problem is that our very language is rooted in the predictability of the Holocene, and the idea that we could rely on the Earth to remain relatively stable while we continued to go on our own trajectory outside, in some way, of the Earth system. But we are now past peak health. Even in the United States, the longevity of white men is beginning to decline. We're seeing rises in microplastics and all sorts of strange diseases beginning to emerge. We are over peak growth economically. Growth rates are now declining because return on investment is less than it used to be. And we may even be over peak democracy if you look around the world today. So we need a new way of knowing. We need many new ways of knowing that are not just drawing on the sciences for the scientists and the humanities for the humanists. We need to begin to talk together, which is why Jan and I are doing this presentation together. And the best framework that has been developed for systems thinking is the Anthropocene. It brings together human systems with the Earth system to give us a way to understand that the technosphere now dominates the biosphere and the geosphere that governed the Earth's functioning for 3.2 billion years. Now we are more powerful than they are. And that those first decades of the Anthropocene, which were the best of times, which gave us longer lives, more of us lived, and we lived more amply. We have to realize that the lessons that we learned in the mid-20th century and the few decades after that, that we could have infinite growth, that problems could be solved by silo thinking, are no longer applicable. We now need new systems of thinking because we have a new Earth system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. We apologize for the slides inconvenience. And now we move forward for our program. The floor is to Professor Jan Zalasiewicz. I don't know if the word is okay, but who is a Professor Emeritus of Paleontology at the University of Leicester, UK. And we ask him to help us in understanding from his point of view of the science he is expert in, what is the uniqueness of the human species. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for that nice introduction. And it really is a true privilege for me to be here speaking to this distinguished audience. Okay. Yeah, speaking to this very distinguished audience in this very special place about how we human beings became the rather unusual and extraordinary creatures that we are. Now, I'd like to start by emphasizing how strong the evidence is that human beings are integrally part of the great tree of life that we see in this image here, and that shows how we are all life forms descended from an unimaginably old, ancient ancestral form. Of course, within that tree, we are nested within the mammals. But nonetheless, despite this place of ours deep in the tree of life, it's nonetheless clear that there really is something qualitatively unique about Homo sapiens, something that sets it apart from all the other forms of life on the Earth today. Now, of course, the same thing can in some way be said about any species, because every species has something special by which we recognize it. But there's nonetheless no doubt that humans are unusual in a variety of ways. For example, there is our very odd habit of walking around on two legs with our trunk held upright, and that has no parallels anywhere else in the natural world. And the physical peculiarities which result from this strange way of getting around are not only bewilderingly numerous, but they're also reflected throughout the structure of our bodies, from our heads to our feet. But nonetheless, I think that pretty much all of us would agree that even more striking than our physical peculiarities is the very unusual, the symbolic way in which we manipulate information in our minds. Now, of course, many other organisms also exhibit remarkably sentient behaviors, sometimes very complex behaviors indeed. But as far as we can tell, in the entire living world, it is only us, human beings, who reason symbolically, which is basically a way of saying that we and we alone habitually deconstruct our interior and exterior worlds into a large vocabulary of discrete mental symbols. In other words, we give things names. And once that vocabulary of names is in place, we can shuffle these symbols around according to rules to make statements not only about the world as it is, but the world as it might be. And it is that unique ability of ours to mentally dissect and to particularize the continuum of the natural world that allows us to make the complex and ever-changing mental associations that govern our daily cognitive existence. Now, this unusual capacity of ours makes it a huge difference in how we're able to perceive our place in nature and to live our social and economic lives within it. And that is mainly because even the smartest non-symbolic organisms are obliged to live in and to react to the world pretty much as nature presents it to them. Whereas we human beings are able, at least for much of the time, to live in the worlds that we each individually recreate in our minds. And this proclivity fundamentally alters our ways both of understanding and of relating to everything that we experience. But still, our cognitive gifts notwithstanding, our place within the tree of life still tells us unmistakably that at some remove we must be descended from an ancestor that was not symbolic. We have a non-symbolic ancestry. And that, of course, invites the very compelling question of just how and when members of our lineage began to reason symbolically. And to put it another way, it begs us to ask exactly how and when, in human prehistory, the gulf between the non-symbolic and the symbolic was bridged. Now, awkwardly, in this context, cognitive states do not preserve directly in the fossil or the archaeological records, which are what we depend upon, really, for information about our very remote past. So in answering this question, we have to look for indirect, proxy indications of symbolic behaviors that might preserve in the material record. And that can be tricky because not everybody agrees on what kinds of evidence might be acceptable as proxies of this sort. Some scholars believe that because of its undoubted complexity, modern human cognition must have very deep roots in time. And that, if it's correct, would strongly imply not only that our cognitive style evolved gradually, but that it can also be incipiently recognized in some very ancient hominin materials, such as the manufacture of stone tools. On the other hand, because behaviors like stone tool making are strictly functional behaviors, other researchers prefer to look for more specifically symbolic indicators of the emergence of modern behaviors. And if we do that, the picture changes very significantly. And I think that is what makes it worthwhile to briefly revisit the archaeological record with the aim of seeing where exactly we can start to pick up indications of when and how we acquired our symbolic thought. Now, this archaeological record, which is the material register of ancient human activities, was inaugurated some 3 million years ago by the invention of the first simple stone tools, such as this sharp-edged flake that we're looking at now. But for the sake of brevity, which I know is important at this point, a useful juncture at which to begin the search for the origins of symbolism is with this species, Homo heidelbergensis, which appeared a lot more recently than those stone tools at about 600,000 years ago. We're just talking about the last 600,000 years. By that point in human evolution, our genus Homo had already got a pretty respectable history behind it, having first appeared around 2 million years ago in Africa in a form rather like the one reconstructed here. Its members were already tall and slender, as you see, but their brains were still of rather modest size. Whereas, in contrast, this later heidelbergensis was the first member of our genus to have been distributed all across the Old World and to have had a brain that was fairly close to human size, as I think you can tell from this comparison with the modern human on the left. Now, this Homo heidelbergensis was capable of some very sophisticated craftsmanship. For example, its members made extremely beautiful stone artifacts by carefully preparing a stone nucleus and working it on both sides until a single blow would detach a more or less finished tool with a cutting edge all around it, as you see in the foreground here. Now, that is already a great tour de force of stone tool making. But in the time of heidelbergensis, many other important technological innovations were also introduced. And among those innovations was the hafting of stone implements into handles, which greatly increased their utility. Homo heidelbergensis also constructed the first artificial shelters, like the one that you can see reconstructed here. And these guys even made fitted lumber, like this piece of carpentry from a site called Kalambo Falls in Zambia. And we also got from this species the first finely shaped pointed stone spears, rather throwing spears of the kind you see here. And it was also during the tenure of heidelbergensis that controlled fire, which is so important. The controlled fire became a regular feature at campsites. It had occasionally occurred before, but never as a regular feature. So in short, Homo heidelbergensis was an extremely clever hominin. But what we do not find in the record left by this very gifted hominin is any unambiguously symbolic artifacts. And because of this, what Homo heidelbergensis seems to be telling us is that it is possible for a hominin to be resourceful and smart and behaviorally flexible and technologically sophisticated, all in the absence of any convincing evidence for symbolic activity. And what is more, we can say the very same thing for the much more famous and slightly later Homo neanderthalensis that you see here. Now, this hominin species, European hominin, emerged from indigenous predecessors around 200,000 years ago. Its members had brains as big as our brains are today, or even bigger. And they were wonderful craftsmen in stone, as you can see from these examples that we see here. The Neanderthals flourished in an age of very difficult climates. They hunted some fearsomely large animals like these woolly mammoths and rhino that you see here. And at least occasionally, they buried their dead. But they left very little to suggest that symbolic behavior was a routine feature of their complex lives. At best, we just find the occasional flash of creativity, such as these eagle talons that were apparently notched to be strung into bodily decoration. So, once again, we find the Neanderthals telling us that there is more than one way in which to be a highly intelligent hominin. Our way is not the only way. And this is perhaps fairly easy to understand in the case of a hominin that was very different physically from us, like Homo sapiens, like Homo neanderthalensis. But perhaps more surprisingly, we can also say the very same thing about the earliest fossil representatives of our own species, Homo sapiens. And that's because while the record shows that by about 230,000 years ago, Homo sapiens like the one we see here had evolved in Africa as a distinctive entity, it is not until around 100,000 years ago, also in Africa, that we start finding intimations of regular symbolic behaviors. For example, objects like these small tick shells, which somebody had pierced for stringing, they hint that by around 100,000 years ago, the plausibly symbolic habit of bodily decoration had begun to be widely expressed. And more explicit evidence of early symbolic behaviors soon follows at a site in South Africa, where this 77,000-year-old ochre plaque from a place called Blombos Cave is only one of several that were deliberately engraved with the geometrical markings that you can see here. And those markings clearly encoded meaning. And they pretty firmly indicate that members of our species had begun at this point to process information in a symbolic manner. And this was also a moment, by the way, in which technological innovation was also beginning to accelerate. And very soon after that, as this map here shows, populations who were descended from those first symbolic modern human beings exited their birth continent of Africa and very rapidly took over the entire old world, basically eliminating all of their competitors in the process. And those competitors not only included Homo neanderthalensis in Western Asia and Homo erectus in Eastern Asia, but also Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, and possibly also Homo naledi in Africa. An absolutely astonishing thing. Never happened before that there was only one kind of hominin left in the world. By around 40,000 years ago, the dazzling cave art of Europe was already being produced, and now we have evidence of a comparable tradition in Indonesia that's even older, suggesting that both traditions had their roots yet earlier in Africa. So clearly then, in the very short period between about 100,000 and 40,000 years ago, which is an eye blink in evolutionary time, a fundamental behavioral transformation within Homo sapiens was sparking a revolution in the way in which hominids did business in the world. So we have to ask ourselves, obviously, well, what had happened? Well, slow and gradual evolution by natural selection is obviously no answer in the case of a dramatically short-term innovation that clearly took place within the tenure of an existing biological species. So in understanding what actually happened in this transition, it's necessary to recall that members of Homo sapiens could not have begun to act and behave in the new ways if they had not already possessed the biological brain wherewithal in order to do so. And the only event in which those biological underpinnings for symbolic behavior are at all likely to have been acquired is the radical developmental reorganization that had resulted long before in the highly distinctive skeletal anatomy of the new species Homo sapiens. And we can see just how different we are by comparing the modern skeleton on the right here to the Neanderthal on the left. And this comparison, which I'm sorry I don't have time to dwell upon, what the bottom line is that it makes it clear that the genetic alterations that were involved in the emergence of this anatomically distinctive Homo sapiens had cascading developmental consequences that we see throughout the skeleton from head to foot. And very plausibly, those changes would have extended also to the soft tissues that don't preserve. And they would have included crucial changes to the structure of the brain, which of course we cannot directly observe. But by permitting more complex associations to be made within the brain itself, those biological alterations were ultimately going to underwrite the emergence of modern cognition. Still, the new potential that was born by those neural innovations evidently lay unexploited for an appreciable length of time until something happened at around 100,000 years ago to stimulate the recruitment of the new behavioral potential. And that recruitment would, by the way, have made this momentous happening in terms of human history. It would have made it a pretty routine, run-of-the-mill evolutionary event, because it would simply have been a matter of recruiting an existing feature for a new purpose in the extremely common process that we know as exaptation. And that would have made it comparable, for example, to the serendipitous discovery, here we go, by ancestral birds that the feathers that they already possessed could be used for the new activity of flying. Something very, very comparable there. And that is something that reminds us that evolution is much less a process of relentless optimization over the eons than it is a matter of simply getting by as well as possible in an unpredictable world with whatever advantages history happens to have handed you. We're not looking at a process of fine-tuning of any kind here. And further, because the biological innovations that underwrote the new way of symbolic thinking were necessarily in place already, as I've explained, it's clear that the stimulus to the change in cognitive function was a purely cultural one. And by far the most plausible candidate we have for this stimulus is the spontaneous invention of spoken language. For one thing, because it depends on a vocabulary of spoken and signed symbols, language is actually the ultimate symbolic activity. And significantly, it appears that the invention of language by a creature that was already biologically predisposed to have it, that could quite easily be just as sudden as the material record suggests it was in this incredibly short period between 100,000 and 70 and 40,000 years ago. For example, theoretical linguists have argued that the algorithmic basis of language is extremely simple, involving just a single cognitive switch. And it's also field linguists have found among deaf children who are housed together for the first time. They have seen languages spontaneously generating generated by these kids. So I've been told to cut things short. So I will move on just to a few final words. Language is something that can be invented very rapidly. Language is something that is intimately related with symbolic thought, and I think the two must have been invented together, sort of in a symbiotic relationship, the one stimulating the other, quite plausibly by children in the context of play. And finally, I should note in this context that the same event should have given rise quite directly to the human capacity for spiritual feeling, which is to say that this is what led to our ability to perceive or believe that there is something greater out there than what we can directly observe. Or in other words, it led to our ability to perceive that instead of being a pinnacle of nature, we human beings are merely a small part of a much greater whole. But still, all that having been said, we cannot ignore either the unusual nature or the vast consequences of our unprecedented cognitive style, which has led to all the shenanigans that we've been hearing about earlier in this session. And if there was ever a single event in which the essence of modern humanity was somehow infused into our lineage, it was surely in that recent and geologically instantaneous moment when human brains first started to make symbolic associations. Now, we take our new intellectual gifts for granted today as central elements of our cognitive experience. But I think it's very humbling to imagine the impact of this transition upon the earliest symbolic Homo sapiens, who had no intellectual context whatever to place it in. And because coming to terms with the new cognitive algorithm must have involved the most radical revolution in mindset that any organism has ever experienced, I think it implies a shift in gears that was so abrupt as to compel us to see all of subsequent history, all of subsequent human history, as above anything else, the story of how we have very imperfectly learned to cope with our radically new way of experiencing both the world and each other. Now, where that learning process will lead, we just can't know. All that is certain in all of this is that this process is an ongoing one, and that by any rational measure, we human beings are still at best works in progress. Yes, we have, to our credit, an astonishing list of amazing achievements, mainly in the sciences and the arts, but on the other side of the ledger, since the end of the last age and the birth of a settled life, we have been appallingly bad stewards, both of our planet, as has been pointed out already in this session, and of each other, as the annals of history amply testify. Now, currently, the auguries for any kind of improvement in these areas don't appear to be very bright. But maybe there are some grounds for optimism, because our new symbolic gifts of imagination and foresight unquestionably offer us at least the potential to reach a new and durable equilibrium with the world around us and with each other. And despite our dubious history, we still retain the option to exercise those gifts in a responsible manner. Thank you all very much.
Grazie professor Tattersal per averci aiutato a comprendere come nasce la capacità simbolica negli esseri umani e grazie alla sua competenza di paleoantropologo, ha concluso la sua relazione dicendo in che modo possiamo diventare responsabili delle capacità che siamo in grado di esprimere. Una parentesi, vi ricordo che avete nella vostra cartellina dei foglietti su cui potete scrivere delle domande da distribuire e far avere ai relatori in modo tale che nel tempo del dibattito, 20 minuti che ci rimarranno, possiamo avere un po' di dialogo con le vostre interrogativi da parte dei relatori. Passiamo ora la parola proprio alla professoressa Sheila Jasanoff, che attualmente insegna scienze e tecnologie, studi di scienze e tecnologie al John F. Kennedy School of Government all'Università di Harvard e che a partire dalla matematica ha un lungo curriculum di studi attraverso il diritto e attraverso la sociologia e si interessa di questi rapporti tra la scienza e la società e ci introduce in quella prospettiva di come possiamo esercitare una responsabilità sulle nostre capacità scientifico-tecnologiche, essendo lei anche la fondatrice e l'animatrice del Global Observatory for Genome Editing, che è nato qualche anno fa e di cui ci parlerà. Grazie, professoressa. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks to my colleagues for these extremely wide-ranging presentations with which you have been regaled this morning. I'm going to ask you for a change of gears because my presentation will be very much focused on today, tomorrow, and the days after. So in that spirit, I'd like to begin with a word of thanks to the organizers of the Pontifical Academy for Life and to Chancellor Monsignor Renzo Pecoraro. I'm honored to be invited to speak here, both as director of the Global Observatory for Genome Editing, as you have heard, and as a scholar with long-standing interests of my own in the future of life, technology, and the destiny of the human. We're meeting at a time of unprecedented turmoil in the global public sphere, as well as in the life of the Holy See, whose great pilgrimage site stands across the street from us. The workshop's title could not have been more opportune. It may not be quite the end of the world, but it does feel, on many days now, that things we thought we knew in the 20th century are vanishing before our eyes, and it is unclear what new worlds are coming into being. Our news media are abuzz with stories of how rapidly and completely things are changing in almost every sector of human experience. In a letter written just a few days ago, the Holy Father eloquently called attention to this poly-crisis, as he termed it. It is as if all the plagues of Egypt have descended on us at once. Nor is Pope Francis alone in observing the end of an era. Here are some words from the head of the World Economic Forum, a very different position, making remarkably similar points. In politics, the great post-war settlement that united liberal democracies around the globe is in tatters. Our environment, as you've already heard, is threatened through centuries of careless overuse, and now is threatening our common future through climate change and its increasingly violent manifestations. Artificial general intelligence is rapidly replacing functions that we once regarded as exclusively the sphere of humans, not only the capacities to reason, synthesize, and reflect with the powers of language, as you heard, but even to be compassionate and responsive to people's emotional needs and wants. And in the domain of life itself, visions of dehumanization, hybridization, and loss of control are resurfacing with increasing urgency. These concerns are not new in themselves. They have been with us. The slide does not seem to be moving. Maybe one can get it back in sync. So these concerns are not new in themselves. They have been with us at least since Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and have continued over the centuries in other iconic works, such as H.G. Wells's Ireland of Dr. Moreau, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and most recently Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go and Clara and the Sun. But in the age of CRISPR-based gene editing, biotechnology promises almost infinite interventions to correct what we identify as defects in human health and human nature. How should we respond to these convergent crises? Our workshop's mission statement offers a succinct place to begin. The multiple crises, environmental, cultural, social, political, of the moment, we're told, oblige us to reconsider our moral perspectives and responsibilities towards the future of humanity and creation. Challenges and hopes for the life of humanity and the planet call for dialogue and cooperation. Once again, the Holy Father's letter to the Academy provides a perceptive gloss as he calls attention to the fraying of international institutions equipped with the power to provide for the global common good. This is, as he says, an urgent task which regards the whole of humanity. These were almost the identical words and ideas that prompted my colleagues and me a decade ago to contemplate and then design the Global Observatory for Genome Editing. For simplicity, I will refer to it as the Observatory from here on. Today, I'd like to say a few words about what initially drove our effort, how we have tried to enact a new vision of responsibility, and some of what we have learned in the process of developing our own modest exercises in dialogue and collaboration on today's seemingly unstoppable eruption of crises. So here's an origin story. To explain the aims of the observatory, let me begin with that origin story. The ideas that led to our project go back several decades. I myself began writing and reflecting on biotechnology and the human future in the 1980s, always with a comparative eye. I was looking at simultaneous legal, political, and commercial developments around genetic engineering in the United States, Europe, and to some extent, India. It was obvious even then that societies neither expected the same benefits from these technologies, nor were they concerned about the same possible harms. The widespread notion that agreement on the science would drive societies toward the same moral judgments proved to be a myth. Clearly, societal values were not simply determined by the facts of nature. They reflected fundamental differences in the criteria by which societies weigh risks and benefits, as well as how they expect to be informed about and protected from future harms. The US approach to biotechnology 45 years ago was very similar to what we see today in the field of digitization and AI. Take big risks with innovation, let the first in the field capture the bulk of the economic rewards, rely on private investors to supplement public resources, make new things first and ask questions about their impacts afterwards, and not worry too much about who gets hurt in the maelstrom of a technological revolution. Europeans, by contrast, were more inclined to think about risk first and the need for novelty afterwards. They worried about unregulated capitalism and also about too intimate a partnership between technology and the state, and they were willing to settle for slower growth in exchange for a more gradual transformation of society through innovation. Of course, these are broad brush accounts, and the contrasts on the two sides of the Atlantic were always more nuanced than one can possibly convey in a half-hour talk. But it was impossible to ignore the fact that ideas of crisis, responsibility, and hope, the subtitle of our conference today, were not the same even across superficially similar societies such as those of Europe and North America. These observations, already well established by the last decade of the 20th century, began laying the foundations for what eventually became the project of the observatory. A second insight that proved equally foundational was the recognition that scientists and engineers were not themselves heedless about the moral consequences of their actions, far from it. Biotechnologists of the 1970s in particular were anxious to avoid the fate of the atomic physicists who gave us the nuclear world, releasing a catastrophic weapon upon a world not yet ready to make wise rules about how to deploy its own lethal ingenuity. It's perhaps known to many in this audience that this anxiety led to the first international meeting dedicated to crafting a governance regime for the powerful biological tools being developed in leading molecular biology labs. Some 150 of the world's leading scientists in this domain, along with a handful of lawyers, social scientists, and reporters, met at Asilomar in California almost exactly 50 years ago, on February 24th to 27th, 1975, to draft principles for how to govern biotechnology's future. That meeting became legendary as a supposedly successful exercise in self-regulation by science, widely praised and emulated as a model for the future because it calmed people's fears, produced reasonable ideas for governing foreseeable risks, and set up an institutional structure that ensured ongoing monitoring of risks and harms as the technologies developed. As Donald Fredrickson, former director of the US National Institutes of Health, observed many years later, the final scene at Asilomar showed an agreement being struck among these scientists regarding the resumption of genetic experimentation. In critical hindsight, however, Asilomar succeeded so well because it was led by a coalition of like-minded participants who were already conditioned to agree on basic elements of how to move forward. They saw promise and excitement in the new technology, but were concerned about novel organisms escaping from the lab and causing disease or environmental harm. Their collective imagination was fixed on the containment of these risks, which could derail an otherwise promising technological trajectory. Not surprisingly, the Asilomar convocation framed out of the debate many of the moral and ethical problems that the world has found since then to be the most difficult. How far should biotechnology go in altering or remaking the natural order? Is it responsible or desirable to mix species, enhance desired characteristics, willfully cause extinctions, bring new forms of life into being? Are there limits? Who should decide? In the observatory's language, we have been calling the Asilomar model science first. This is because Asilomar took the moving frontiers of science and technology as their start line, asking only what downstream risks might make some innovation pathways unacceptable to pursue. Left out of that frame were questions that have troubled religious and philosophical minds, authors of speculative fiction, clinicians, parents, and laypeople around the world. What happens to the integrity or indeed the moral worth of the human when key aspects of being human are subjected to selection, standardization, mechanization, and commerce? Yet the main governance model that we have inherited from Asilomar is one which takes its question framings from science, as if ethical considerations and moral reflection must follow only where science shows that there is a series of questions to be asked. Remarkably, people tend to take the science-first approach for granted, whether they see the science in question as being high risk, needing regulation, or ready to be turned into technological applications with high commercial potential. We have come to think of this as the traffic light approach, using a metaphor that is current among life scientists and technologists working at the frontiers of biotechnology. To see how the model works, we need only to run through the three positions of the traffic light: red, yellow, and green. To start with the red light, this is where scientists' own intuitions urge caution. A very recent example is an article on mirror life that appeared in Science magazine just a few months ago, in December 2024, urging a need for caution and calling, in their own terms, for broader discussion among the global research community, policymakers, research funders, industry, civil society, and the public to chart an appropriate path forward. More generally in this model, the public and democracy itself are seen as ignorant and fearful, needing to be carefully educated until they come around to accepting that science will help them. It is accordingly science's responsibility to predict and anticipate societal resistance and to find ways forward. The yellow light takes a slightly more optimistic view of public understanding. It calls for steadiness while appropriate governance regimes are created and put in place. Here, it is assumed that ethics will be involved in setting appropriate rules and limits, often under the guidance of professional bodies able to summon together the relevant experts. Once those rules are in place, the now authorized research will be safe, effective, and ethical, because all moral quandaries have been confronted and resolved. Last but not least are those areas where scientists find such excitement pressing the bounds of the unknown that they're convinced that science should speed up. In this green light version, it is deemed to be in humanity's interest that technologies should be introduced fast because they will alleviate suffering and clear the way to big societal payoffs. The standard argument here sees public ignorance as an obstacle that needs to be overcome through action rather than education. Once public proofs are offered that a technology works, it is assumed that people will shed their inhibitions and gladly accept the novelties on offer. This is the sort of thinking that led the now infamous Chinese researcher, Dr. He Jiankui, to genetically engineer 3 babies with heritable genetic resistance to HIV/AIDS in 2018. He assumed that people would applaud his breakthrough, just as global society several decades earlier had come to terms with in vitro fertilization as a cure for infertility. In this green light model, it is assumed to be science's responsibility to push the envelope, to show backward-looking people what they're missing out on, and to persuade them by example that hyper-caution is itself a kind of moral error when many can benefit and no one will be hurt. All 3 stages of the traffic light imply responsibility and care. After all, at the historic Asilomar meeting in 1975, it was scientists themselves who took the lead, first with a moratorium, or red light, and then with regulatory standards, or a yellow light. In each of the stages of the traffic light science, there's some room for deliberation and some room for ethics once science establishes the contours of the roadways along which the vehicles of moral reflection and deliberation must drive. In sum, this by now standard approach to science and ethics casts science as sovereign in relation to ethics. The core presumption is that the institutions of science are well enough equipped to govern the forms of novelty that they generate. Time and appropriate leadership by science, it is assumed, will take care of downstream effects in the forms of undue public hesitancy or resistance. People will come around either because what was once strange and novel became naturalized, and even laggards think nothing of welcoming the new technology into their lives, or because the establishment of regulatory guidelines persuades them that what once seemed risky is now safe enough. This has happened with modes of food production, locomotion, communication, manufacturing, and other infrastructures such as drinking water from taps that people now accept as part and parcel of everyday life. Accordingly, all that scientists and technologies must do to be responsible is remain alert to the need to involve others in the governance debates that science initiates at its own frontiers. At the first International Summit on Genome Editing in 2015 in Washington, D.C., the Nobel laureate and distinguished science leader David Baltimore put it this way: in 1975, as today, we believed that it was prudent to consider the implications of a remarkable achievement in science, and then as now, we recognized we had a responsibility to include a broad community in our discussions. If Asilomar remains the touchstone for science's freedom to self-regulate, the story of in vitro fertilization, or IVF, as it is commonly told, has become a kind of modern-day parable for why biotechnology, too, should be entitled to take the lead in its own governance. Conventional wisdom has it that IVF precisely followed the traffic light model to humanity's overall betterment and a great increase in human happiness around the world. So ingrained is this story that even Donald Trump, no great friend of science or women or technologically assisted reproduction, has claimed bragging rights over making IVF more affordable and accessible. How did this consensus position come about, and what are its implications? There's no question that the news media represented Louise Brown's birth in 1978 as a page out of a science fiction novel, something unimaginable, unnatural, and wild. Brown was immediately dubbed a test tube baby, symbolizing her birth in a lab, although the test tubes, in fact, were not the kind of glass dishes best suited to the process developed by Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards and their colleagues. Contemporary estimates vastly downplayed the eventual demand for the technology, which has been steadily rising over the past 3 decades, so that by common estimates, IVF accounts for some 2% of babies born in the United States now. The technology has steadily improved, and tighter regulation has lowered the chances of multiple births, carrying significantly greater risks of adverse health outcomes for both mothers and children. By the time 2010 rolled around, IVF was seen as enough of a game changer in the history of human reproduction that Edwards, the only still living member of the pioneering British team behind Louise Brown's birth, was awarded that year's Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. Concurrently, infertility was more securely classified as a disease, one that, thanks to science, was now amenable to treatment through technologically assisted means. This is the classic linear model of discovery to innovation to cheerful public acceptance on which science prides itself. From scare story to parable, IVF has come full circle. Yet from the standpoint of relations between science, ethics, and democracy, this is only one way of looking at what was and remains a profoundly more complicated story. Indeed, talking about IVF only in terms of the linear model does not do justice to the scale or nature of this technological breakthrough, and it underplays the degree to which societal consensus has been achieved at the cost of placing many questions essentially out of the boundaries of deeper moral reflection. In this slide, I gesture toward the broader field of normative questions that the linear history of IVF fails to take into account. One can see these unanswered questions as arising from a failure by science and society to grapple adequately with the metaphysical questions that IVF raises. Fixated as scientists tend to be on questions of physical risk and safety, such as the need to lower the number of multiple births, few stop to ask what happens when new entities are produced that destabilize the meanings of some of the most foundational terms that the order of the social world takes for granted, terms like mother, father, child, and infant. Each column in this slide represents ethical, legal, and economic issues that arose because IVF invisibly changed social meanings. So the first column on the left deals with motherhood. IVF made possible the splitting apart of three aspects of motherhood that had never before been decoupled: genetic, gestational, and social. These days, a woman past normal childbearing age can still conceive through the implantation of an embryo created from a donated egg. She is then the birth mother and likely the social mother, but not the genetic mother. Alternatively, a woman who has had trouble carrying a child to term can become a genetic and a social mother by having another woman carry her child through a surrogate pregnancy. In yet a third scenario, a surrogate inseminated with a male partner's sperm hands over the resulting child to a female or possibly male partner who is neither the genetic nor the gestational parent, but hopes to rear the husband's genetic child as her or his own. This was the situation in the notorious Baby M case that first brought the issue of surrogacy to the attention of a rapt American public through a highly visible court case almost 40 years ago. Hundreds of disputes and some tragedies have arisen as a result of the miracle technology of IVF. Each is interesting in its own terms, involving some of the most fundamental desires that humans have for love and belonging, caretaking, and making families. My point here, however, has more to do with the narrowing down of meanings that has accompanied discussions of IVF through the decades. It has taken sporadic lawsuits, egregious misconduct, or birth defects and errors in clinics to bring to light issues that might have concerned thinking societies from much earlier on. What does it mean to unbraid the strands of motherhood? What is the status, biological, legal, moral, of an IVF embryo? And what happens to the institution of the family when IVF rapidly alters the numbers and kinds of partnerships through which children can be born? I'd like to spend the remainder of my time quickly on the ways in which the observatory has sought to create a different paradigm from science first and traffic lights. This is to start with the question of meanings and to reposition the debates on science and technology within an envelope that puts society's questions and concerns first. I described this turn as being away from Schrödinger's famous scientific question, what is life, to the enduring question of purpose for all of us, what is life for? You may prefer to think not in words but in pictures, and it's worth remembering that one of the most famous holdings of the Boston Art Museum near where I live is this painting, which has as its text, where do we come from, what are we, where are we going? And I think that these resonate very much with the purposes of this conference that we're involved in today. So supposing we take that as our starting point, then we recognize that innovation in science and technology frequently brings to light issues that we may think of sooner as constitutional rather than technical. No traffic lights here. These questions involve the definitions and boundaries of the human, what are the beginnings and the ends of life, and indeed non-life, Where is the human and non-human boundary? They involve what I have called ontological surgery. How do we classify things in law so that we clearly position entities on one or another side of a meaningful normative boundary? And they concern implications for entitlements, such as rights, dignity, and property. So Julia Thomas talked about the need for new orderings at the end of her presentation, but I would like to suggest that we actually begin with many of these ideas already, and it's a question of reconfiguring them in the pathways of innovation. So the Global Purpose Observatory, to these ends, has charted out three functions for itself. First, to curate well-articulated perspectives on questions such as these. Second, to analyze the foundations of thought, not just what is treated differently, but why and how. And thirdly, to convene excluded voices, ones that are not normally included in the science-first paradigm or the understanding of traffic lights, with their casting of the public as somewhere between ignorant and misguided. So what is needed? We believe that what we need is an expanded range of questions to start with, and for that also a formula for expanded deliberations. First of all, crossing national, disciplinary, and sectoral boundaries. Secondly, creating modes of deliberation that are inclusive and draw upon a wider range of human experience and moral imagination. Thirdly, a global dialogue. And lastly, the institutional infrastructures required to recognize and facilitate this variety of mechanisms of deliberation for governance. Now, these are incredibly lofty aims, and the observatory, as an entity based in 3 different universities and small collaborations funded by one grant-giving agency, cannot possibly hope to accomplish things. And this is why the fact that this Pontifical Academy's purposes resonate so clearly with ours has been a source of immense enthusiasm for our group. We believe that good deliberation depends on good framings. Do the dominant framings, such as the traffic light model, invite or suppress deliberation? What are the questions? Are there alternatives? And what is typically not asked? How does one raise the society-focused questions? And again, these are all questions whose answers we're experimenting with, because these are evolving kinds of processes and not really questions that have right and wrong answers. So I want to conclude by saying that the alternatives that we have in mind require us at the very least to move away from a purely physicalist and materialist vision of life. And to illustrate what I mean, here is Borges' Library of Babel story that, again, many of you may know, but you may not have registered that the story begins, or the story was published a dozen years before the decoding of the structure of DNA, and yet his description of the library and of the actors scurrying around inside it bears uncanny resemblances to biologists' search for the control of life in the genomic age. The library is immense, its halls are endless, there are reflective mirrors. Just as the human genome encodes infinitely many future lives, so the library allows for the generation of all possible works of language. Then there's the architecture held together by and these are Borges' own words, a spiral stairway which sinks abysmally and soars upwards to remote distances. That spiraling structure, branching into the rooms of the library, seems as if it was inspired in a premonitory dream by the as yet undiscovered double helix of DNA's sugar phosphate backbone, holding the eternally paired and bonded bases, adenine to thymine and cytosine to guanine. Are there other ways to imagine life and its meanings? And I want to conclude by suggesting that there are, but in order to get there, we have to turn our minds to other languages and other modes of thought. So I will conclude by quoting a the words of a song that in Bengali, my mother tongue, is frequently sung at memorial services for the old and the dying. Yesterday, our colleague, Professor talked about wishing to speak in French, and we heard this morning as well, but we rarely hear the languages of the Global South being invoked in settings like this. So, aguner paroshmoni chwao prane, e jibon punno karo dahon dane, amar ei dehokhani tule dharo, tomar oi debaloy prodip karo, nishidin alok shikha joluk gane, আধারের গায়ে গায়ে পরশ তব সারা রাত ফোটাক তারা নব নব নয়নের দৃষ্টি হতে ঘুচবে কালো যেখানে পড়বে সেথায় দেখবে আলো ব্যথা মোর উঠবে জ্বলে ঊর্ধ্বপানে আগুনের পরশমণি ছোঁয়াও প্রাণে. So this has a prayerful quality that I think is very different from the materialism of the search for cures with DNA. And I would invite us to think about the future, including the observatory's own future, in terms of creating dialogues that are not currently even imaginable within the constraints of this amazing capacity for language and symbolic thought that my predecessor, Dr. Tattersal, spoke to us about. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yazanov. Now we have maybe 20 minutes before the coffee break to have some answers to the many questions we received. So I asked the speakers also to make a choice because probably we won't be able to answer all the big questions you raised. So we can follow the same order as we did before. Thank you very much. Yep.
How about that? Can you hear me? Hey, okay, good. We're rolling. Right. Okay, there have been several very good questions about the Anthropocene. Some of basic science, which we didn't have the time to really explain. One is about the carbon cycle, change of carbon concentration in the atmosphere and Earth is cyclic, question mark. And so how does the current rise fit into that? And the answer is that, yes, it is cyclic, and there is a superb record of atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide preserved within the layers of ice that was once snow in Antarctica and Greenland. And that shows quite clearly that carbon dioxide oscillated between 180 parts per million and in cold periods of glacial times, and 280 parts per million, plus or minus, in warm periods. And it has been oscillating up and down like that on that. And in geological time before, we have a rather rougher estimates of that. But what the record shows is that the current rise in CO2 that started slowly in about 1850 and then really took off in 1950 is without precedent in Earth's planetary history, we think, as a whole, let alone recently, in that. And the amount of extra carbon dioxide we have added, our carbon dioxide from our industry, is a little bit over 1 trillion tons, and that is equivalent to a layer of pure carbon dioxide about 1 meter thick, just over 1 meter thick, around the Earth. That layer is growing now at the rate of about 1 millimeter every 2 weeks. So it's growing roughly at the rate, or rather faster than the rate a child is growing, and will in that. So that is, if you like, one of the science behind the Anthropocene. Another one, quickly, what is the difference between Anthropocene and anthropocentric? Is this our epoch? And the answer is no. It's a planetary epoch. It's an epoch of the Earth. We happen as humans to have caused it, precipitated it on that. But the importance of the processes and of the changes would be just as great if they had been caused by, let's say, extraordinary volcanic action, or by the impact of a meteorite, or by anything else like that. Quite natural. And would be rather easier, I think, for us humans to get on with. The Anthropo of the Anthropocene was an improvisation by Paul Crutzen. The important bit is a scene, that's geology, but had it been, let's say, had he thought of the Technocene, or the Pyrocene, or the Plasticene, or something else, the meaning would have been exactly the same, but some of the discussions around it, of course, might have been different. So it's emphatically, involves human history, but it is a description of a planetary change in there. And just very quickly, one question. In a world where temperatures are rising, please explain why some parts of the world, like Africa, there are parts of the world where it is going colder. While the Earth's climate is being disrupted in general, and generally temperatures are rising, the disruptions include some areas. Noticeably, there's a cold blob in the Atlantic off Greenland, where cold has been brought from the North Pole down where it belongs to where it doesn't belong, much farther south. So the Earth's temperature geometry, as it were, has been disrupted. Mostly it has warmed. Overall, it has warmed by this little more than 1.5 degrees, but that does include areas of increased cold. And that may well happen to Europe if the Gulf Stream switches off, as has been mooted. So the Anthropocene climate is and will be complicated, and not a simple path of warming. Okay, a couple more for Julia.
A couple more for us both. One is, if the impacts of the human presence are important already before the mid-20th century, why fix the beginning of the Anthropocene at this year? Wouldn't it be better to speak of the long Anthropocene and the great acceleration after 1945? The essential difference here is that before the mid-20th century, human beings, like all other creatures, living creatures, impacted their environment, their immediate environments. And we have been doing this for 300,000 years, and even our Homo sapiens ancestors developed fire. They certainly had impacts on their environment. So environmental change is different from Anthropocenic change, from the change in the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene refers to the transformation of the Earth system and the way it works. Human beings have always impacted their environment. We have never transformed the Earth system. This is why this event is so extraordinary. The next question is the big question we all ask: what do we do if our destructive actions have brought us to the point of no return and irreversible change? What on earth do we do? And the questioner kindly notes that her students ask this question too. His students ask this question too. And I'm sure we all get asked this. So the first thing I think we need to do is to recognize that we are not going back to the Holocene. There's no fixing this. There is no return to a stable Earth that our species enjoyed for almost 12,000 years. That's terrible to recognize. And then the question is, what do we hope for? Not some vague hope. We need to define what is possible in these new circumstances. And for many people, it's very difficult to give up that modern myth, that modern hope that we could have infinitely growing liberty on the basis of an infinitely growing economy. And it's perhaps particularly difficult for us in this room because, of course, it's been very, very good to us, this hope. But what we have to do is restructure hope to something quite different and something more modest, which is to understand that the best we might aim for, if we do so as community, is resilience with decency. Less glamorous, but if we could manage a bit of decency and manage to rebuild local communities in ways in which we are supportive and we remove our needs from having to be serviced by the technosphere, we may actually be able to weather the next few decades and come out all right at the end. So it's not glittery hope, but it's solid and decent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you all for your questions. I have quite a pile of questions here and not very much time. So if I miss any, I hope you will forgive me. I have one here. In your opinion, what about a link between diluvium/sea level increases and the bipedality of hominids? And as you know, probably most of you, there have been claims of a certain aquatic phase of human evolution in the past. It's not an idea to which most people would subscribe. But we have lived as that wonderful, very ragged climate curve that Jan showed us at the beginning of his talk shows. There have been extraordinary excursions over the last couple of million years, extraordinary excursions in sea levels, as the climate has changed. As it got colder, sea levels went down, and as it got warmer, the ice on the land melted and the sea levels went up again. And that has created a very frustrating situation for paleoanthropologists, because right now we are at a stage of high sea levels, which means that a lot of the land surface that might well have been inhabited by hominids in the past is now drowned and not really available for exploration, and that is a shame. As for bipedality, bipedality goes right back to the beginning of the hominin story. It goes back a very, very long way, and as I was discussing just the other day with my colleague, Professor Piavani here, I think that the origin of bipedality is actually not due to any external force, but rather to this question of exaptation that I talked about before. I don't think that any creature coming to the ground, any arboreal creature coming to the ground, is likely to have walked upright on two legs, as our ancestor obviously did, for any other reason than that it was the most comfortable thing to do. You wouldn't stand up to see farther, to run faster, to deter predators, or any of the things that have been suggested. Basically, you would come to the ground, and the reason you'd stand upright and stay upright, even if danger threatened, would be because you already had a habit of holding your trunk upright in the trees. And I think we're upright today because our arboreal ancestor was suspensory. It hung from branches and held its body habitually upright already. So that's one question. Here's another one. This one is about language, and what's the relationship between oral and spoken and and written language. And of course, my guess would be that spoken language goes back to that event at some point around maybe 70, 80,000, maybe as much as 100,000 years ago, when humans started indulging in symbolic activities. So that's a long history. The history of writing is actually a much shorter history. It goes back to about 5,000 years ago, when people discovered that they could preserve the language that they already possessed via writing it down in some means of notation. So basically, written and spoken language are not processed exactly in the same way in the brain, but they're conceptually the same thing. You're going from a spoken language to a spoken plus a written language situation. And do I have time just for one more? Okay, just for one more, and I apologize to you others. And this question is about dreaming and symbolism. You know, is dreaming a symbolic activity? Well, you know, I don't think anybody that's ever lived with a dog would, you know, think other than that, yes, other mammals dream. Not only humans dream, but other mammals during their sleep experience something that looks from the outside, obviously, very much like dreaming. But dreaming is basically a sort of a housekeeping activity of the brain as it sort of resets itself during sleep overnight. And I don't think that dreaming for a non-symbolic animal means the same thing as dreaming for a symbolic animal. I think when humans became symbolic, started processing information in a symbolic manner, that changed all the rules. And that would include the rules that apply to sleep and dreaming as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Tattersal. We leave the last word to Professor Yazanov. She received a few questions. Maybe you can say something about them.
Yes, thank you. I also have a few questions, and I'll just try to be brief in addressing them. So one is about the exponential transformation of humans and human society, and what does this imply for ecological risks? So I think that especially the first presentation on the Anthropocene went into quite a lot of detail about what the multiplicity of human activities on Earth mean for the overall ecology of the planet. So there's not much point my going into those details, but what I'm concerned with to some extent is contemporary intellectual history. And one thing that I see in people's rush to studying the Anthropocene is to some degree a downplaying of the moral responsibility of humans for these very same ecological risks. So to what extent are we and our institutions responsible for framing questions of risk in certain ways, and what are we perhaps ignoring or leaving out of the equation? It remains the case that microbiomes are likely not capable of moral thought, even if dogs dream. I mean, there are variations in the capacity to imagine and take responsibility that do vary across species, and I think that that is an important thing for us to keep in mind, especially in the setting where we are now, because religious traditions, of course, have thought about exactly these kinds of questions for a very long time. A second question is again, a quite challenging one. And reproductive biology is changing. Is reproduction moving from humans to social structures? So I think I would say that reproduction and reproductive biology have always been enmeshed in social structures. I was recently in West Africa, and it was interesting to see the ways in which the inherited polygamous traditions of the area are coexisting with a more recently imported Christian tradition of monogamy, and the two systems of reproduction and social structure are living side by side, as when our very secular driver who said he had left the church happily described his father's 3 wives and how all of the children coexist in some fashion and enjoy the benefits, actually, of having multiple mothers and so on and so forth. So the question, again, is not, is reproduction moving from individuals to social structures, but how is the incorporation of particular technologies altering the possibilities for which kinds of social structures are deemed to be natural and not natural? And since naturalization is such a powerful force in morality, who is carrying out that process of naturalization? Is it happening invisibly, or is it happening thoughtfully and reflectively? These are, again, questions that we might worry about and that the observatory, I think, is dedicated to worrying about. And lastly, do you think that science is rushing our humanity to accept what is unethical? What to do then? Well, I think that I tried to counter this sense of science driving us in a couple of different ways that I think are important to reiterate. I think science remains an extraordinarily powerful force in society, not simply because it creates novelty and gives us new ways of changing our lives, but because it also puts questions of responsibility on the table, questions that scientists themselves have been grappling with. But I think that all social structures have limited imaginations, and when scientists imagine moral questions, they tend to think of the moral questions that can be answered scientifically. But not all moral questions can be answered scientifically, so I would slightly reframe this question and say, is science narrowing our imagination of what the moral issues are, such that other sectors of society that also see science as paramount and extremely powerful are, in a sense, censoring themselves not to put their own moral concerns out there on the table. And we find this in the observatory's work when we invite some of the most learned and thoughtful religious, philosophical, legal experts to the table. They say to us, well, we don't know anything about genome editing. And it takes enormous amounts of persuasion to say, you may not know anything about genome editing, but you certainly understand the social compact and the constitutional character of humans in democracy. And that's where we want you to begin and come to the technology later. So I think that the big danger of the power of science and technology is that they narrow the range of imaginations from which we begin to ask questions about what futures are we working towards, and are we excluding the more beneficial ones in a mad rush to achieve what is either commercially beneficial in the moment or seems easy to achieve technologically. That's how I would address that question, and thank you again for your interest.
Grazie molte a tutti I nostri relatori. Thank you very much to our speakers. Penso che la sessione di questa mattina abbia ulteriormente fatto maturare la domanda che infatti affronteremo nella prossima sessione sulla responsabilità e sulla speranza. Nel senso che abbiamo visto come la scienza modifichi la comprensione del mondo, ma anche la comprensione di noi stessi. E quindi ci aiuta a riformulare le domande in un modo nuovo, e questa è una delle caratteristiche del dialogo transdisciplinare, e quindi si tratterà di comprendere come la nostra responsabilità. Abbiamo iniziato meditando come Elohim nella creazione ha limitato la sua capacità di creazione, e quindi per essere co-creatori di Dio si tratta di vivere la stessa modalità di dominare il dominio di cui stiamo diventando sempre più capaci in tutta la biosfera. Quindi ci troviamo qua alle 11:30 dopo la pausa caffè per riprendere con la prossima sezione. Grazie. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we did a little bit messed up the beginning. I'm sorry. I also